The nonprofit sector is on the verge of some massive changes. The recent election in the United States will absolutely impact the industry's future. In this video, I'm going to talk about 5 things that nonprofits need to be aware of with the upcoming change in administration in the United States. So if the next 4 years are anything like the first 4 years in Trump's first administration, then we are in for some pretty dramatic changes in the economy and also in certain policies. And whenever there's a shift, especially in the economy or in federal policy, everyone is impacted, but I want to talk in particular about nonprofits and the things you just need to be aware of and how you can prepare yourself for what's coming next. This video is for you if you're interested in nonprofits, if you're starting a nonprofit, you already have one, and you're trying to figure out how to navigate, or if there's anything that you should be paying attention to. In this video, I'm going to go over 5 areas to watch, including tax laws, federal grants, the federal government workforce, foundations, and tariffs. And at the end of this video, I'm just going to give a little bonus to watch. I don't want to make this too long because this can get really complicated. But in the end, I want to share a really quick bonus note that everyone should be mindful of. All right, so let's get into it. So the first area nonprofits really need to pay attention to is around tax laws and tax provisions. And I really want to talk about how that impacts charitable giving. That's going to be the point of this first area we're going to talk about. And let me just say this, the administration is not in place yet at the recording of this video. It's the end of 2024. And it's hard to say what will be. It's hard to say what's being talked about and then what will actually turn into law. And a lot of times when a law is being made, it starts with an initial idea, but through compromise and through negotiation through both houses and with the White House, that does shift and change. So I really can't say to you what will be. I'm really going to talk to you about what history has shown us, especially with this particular administration, and what you need to be mindful of and what probably or will likely happen based on history. So in 2017, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was passed. And that had a major impact on tax law in the United States. And it ended up having a really major impact on how people give, which actually impacted the nonprofit industry, whether you realized it or not. So one of the biggest ways it impacted nonprofits is with the standard deduction. I need you to stay with me, okay? Because I know this can get a little complicated when we're talking about taxes, but it's really important that you understand how this made a difference. And let me just say, I am not an accountant. I am not your accountant. I'm providing general information about how to understand this because it does impact us whether you understand taxes or have gone to school for this or not. So what it did was it doubled the standard deduction. And you have 2 main ways that you can claim charitable deductions on your personal taxes. You can either itemize them or get the standard deduction. So the way that works is if you choose to itemize, say you give to a bunch of charities or you donate goods in the year and you add up the cost of that, well, that amount you can use to help offset the cost of your taxes. So if you do your calculations right, you may be able to have a lot of charitable deductions that allow you to decrease the amount of taxes that you owe if you end up owing at the end of the year. Well, with the standard deduction, you don't have to go bit by bit and add every one. You can just use a standard number that the government gives you. So if you add up all of those donations that you have for the year and it's less than the standard deduction, then you will go with the standard deduction because the number's higher. What happened with this new law in 2017 is that number doubled. So what do you think happened? A lot of people were like, well, I don't need to give to charities to claim that on my taxes. I can just take the standard deduction. So what a lot of nonprofits feared is that people would take that attitude and they would say, well, we don't necessarily have to give for a tax benefit, so we don't have to give as much as we've given. And a lot of people feared that giving would go down. Well, what do you think happened? In the very next year, giving was actually impacted. The Lilly Family School of Philanthropy estimated that that law caused a deduction in giving by $17 billion. That was their estimate for how much was lost in the next year. And they even calculated by individual persons. And they estimated that individuals gave on average $880 less than they normally would have given to charities or nonprofits in that year. So it had an impact on charitable giving. I'm gonna tell you a couple more things that happened though with that law. A lot of the provisions favored people with more wealth and it favored corporations. So what it also did was increase the limit that people could use to offset their gross income. So instead of 50% of their income, people could give up to 60% of their income. So obviously, if you have less money, you're less likely to give 50 and 60% of your income. But if you're making a lot of money and you're trying to offset your tax burden, it's to your advantage to be able to give more to charity so that you have to pay less taxes. The other thing is the corporate tax rate. So the amount of taxes that corporations were taxed on was decreased. It went from 35% to 21%. So those extra two provisions you would think would boost giving, right? So if wealthier people are able to give more, then more money goes to nonprofits. And if corporations have to pay less in taxes, then they may be more charitable. What do you think happened? Well, as a result, wealthier people did actually give more, and a few people gave at record numbers. I'm thinking about Mackenzie Scott, but that didn't offset the amount that was lost from more middle class and lower income people by that standard deduction change. And corporations did not give more. They just gave on a steady rate, and there were no huge increases in giving by corporations. So why did I just go through all of that? I wanted to explain that because history matters and it gives us a sense of what's going to happen next. So the provisions in that tax law expire next year. So with the new administration, it's very likely that those provisions will be extended, or they may even be updated and changed even more. And if they're changed to be more favorable to wealthier people and to corporations, then we're going to see the same trends continue. We may see people potentially give less who have smaller incomes, and people with more incomes may give more, but there are other things that may impact who they give to and how they give. And we see that corporations still aren't held responsible for being charitable. They are paying less taxes, but there is no push and incentive for them to give more to charitable causes. So this is a huge signal to nonprofits, because in the industry, there's a lot of talk about how nonprofits are losing money. Grants are getting smaller. People are giving less, right? There's a lot of talk about how nonprofits are going to survive going into the next couple of years because we've been in an economic downturn. So it's important to follow the data, right? So there's more money being put in the hands of wealthier folks and of corporations. And so while I really do agree that nonprofits should engage everybody and that people who have smaller incomes are still very, very important to their donor base, nonprofits with major budgets who have a significant amount of money that they need to maintain year to year really do need to consider major donor strategies, and they need to think about developing partnerships with corporations and pushing corporations to be more responsible to their local communities. And while it may seem like a good thing, wealthier people can give more so we have more access, unfortunately, not a lot of nonprofits have access to the networks that wealthy donors occupy. We know that giving comes through trust. We know that people give to what they know and what they trust. But if you don't have the opportunity to meet these people, if they don't have an opportunity to engage with your mission, then how can they care about it? How can they be inspired to give if they don't even know you exist? And so it almost makes it harder for people to access larger amounts of money because, again, people give to what they know and they trust. They give to larger organizations, and donors aren't always really proactive about finding new organizations or investing in new organizations unless people come to them or it falls into their lap. So it does present an interesting challenge for nonprofits. And I would just say nonprofits are not all the same, obviously. So smaller and mid-sized and new nonprofits have different challenges than those nonprofits that have multi-million-dollar budgets. But to me, it's all still data. So you know what's happening, you know where things are trending, and so you have to adjust in the meantime. So here's the second thing you need to pay attention to with the new administration coming in: federal grant funding. With any administration change, this one is no different. There's always going to be a shift in where federal money goes. There are some core federal programs where it hasn't really shifted. You can pretty much count on the funding being there. Now the levels may shift or may change, or the amount of money available may change, but they're pretty solid. Things like Medicaid and Medicare. So those are those core programs. that typically don't shift. And then you have other programs that are more discretionary. So that means that they are probably temporary, or they're based on some kind of initiative or some kind of agenda that's being pushed by the administration. And every administration has its agenda. So George W. Bush was really focused on faith-based initiatives. And so you saw a lot of efforts and money going towards community-based organizations that were like faith-based. When Barack Obama first came in, it was a real big push around accountability. There was a big push around equity. So you saw a lot of programs reflect those values. So every administration has its own agenda, and it's no different with the Trump administration. So there's quite a bit of federal government funding that's going to follow the agenda and the priorities of the president and the priorities of the Republican Party, because they dominate all three branches of the government. So you're going to see a lot of programs and policies that favor their ideology, and you're going to see money follow their values. One really concrete example is you may see more funding for abstinent-only programs, or you may see funding that promotes businesses or supports businesses in this country, because that's where their values align. So you got to pay attention to how your nonprofit's mission fits within that. Unfortunately, the flip side of that is this administration has been very clear about what they want to dismantle and the things that they denounce. So if your nonprofit focuses on issues around human rights, around immigration, around racial equity, around LGBTQIA issues, climate change, and even Department of Education programs, they are absolutely at risk and may have to look elsewhere for federal government funding. So if my mission was around those key areas, I absolutely would be paying attention to the funding landscape, assessing my budget, seeing if any of the grants that I have are at risk as a result of this, and then planning years ahead, because you may be safe now. You may have a grant agreement where money may be covered for 2 or 3 years, but then what happens after that? You need to be preparing now for changes and shifts, because a lot of times when a new administration comes in, it takes a year or two for changes to take effect. So there is some room, there is some time for you to adjust and prepare yourself. But if you need to do that, you need to be doing that right now. One other thing I want to say about federal government funding is that it doesn't all come just from the federal government. A lot of federal government funding funnels through the state government, and a lot of times people get money from the state government and don't realize that it's federal funding. Right? One example is Department of Labor programs. There are a lot of workforce development programs for young people, or people where it's hard for them to find jobs. A lot of that programming is from the federal government. It's from the Department of Labor. They just pass that money to the states. And so if some of that money goes away, then that also means that state budgets may shrink, and that may impact what happens on the local level. So not only pay attention to federal politics, but pay attention to what's happening in the decisions made at your state and local level, because that absolutely will impact the availability of government grant funding. Here's the third area I would pay attention to: the federal government workforce. And this hits really close to home because I'm from Maryland and I'm from the DC metropolitan area. And if you know anything about this area, a lot of people work for the federal government here. There are a lot of federal government jobs here, and it really does fuel the local economy, not just in DC, but in parts of Maryland and in parts of Virginia. But why am I bringing this up? Why am I talking about the federal government workforce? Because if you haven't noticed lately, there's been a lot of talk about shrinking the federal government workforce. Elon Musk, which I never thought I would bring this up in the context of the government, but Elon Musk and his partner Vivek, I'm not going to attempt to say his last name, it's on the screen, but they have been charged to develop the Department of Government Efficiency. And it's kind of vague what they're going to do, but they have put out an op-ed about why they plan to head this up. So these are two private businessmen who are going to be put in charge of putting together a government agency. We're not sure if it's going to be a government agency, but at least some kind of commission to talk about how to make the federal government more efficient. But if you've heard Elon Musk talk about the government workforce, they absolutely want to reduce the workforce. And there are quite a bit of people who live in this area who are concerned about that, because that has a real impact on people's families, on people's livelihoods, their ability to pay rent, their ability to pay their mortgages. So it really does have an impact, but I want to talk about why it impacts nonprofits. Let me read to you an excerpt of what they plan to do and what they have written about this. In an op-ed that they wrote, they said, "We are assisting the Trump transition team to identify and hire a lean team of small government crusaders, including some of the sharpest technical and legal minds in America. The team will work in the new administration closely with the White House Office of Management and Budget. The two of us will advise DOGE at every step to pursue three major kinds of reform: regulatory rescissions, administrative reductions, and cost savings. We will focus particularly on driving change through executive action based on existing legislation rather than by passing new laws. Our North Star for reform will be the U.S. Constitution." So I'm going to read that last line one more time. Our North Star for reform will be the U.S. Constitution. I'm just saying, as a citizen, that gives me pause that two businessmen want to help rewrite the Constitution. I did not vote for them. And just fair warning, this is just my personal opinion. I did not vote for them. Who gets to say that they get to write or suggest changes to the Constitution? And what in the world are you suggesting to change in the Constitution? That's not your role. That's not your job. Slow your roll. Just my opinion. So I like to bring you the actual information so you can decide for yourself what this means, but I want to break down how this impacts nonprofits. There are 2 million people who are currently in the federal government workforce, not just in the DC area, but all across the country and all across the world, honestly. So part of what they want to do, I think, is to reduce inefficiency. So they believe that there are people who are doing jobs that are not important or not essential and can be eliminated. But some of this may include reducing or eliminating jobs that other people need to do. So presumably you would think, well, the nonprofit sector or another sector can pick up those jobs that the federal government isn't doing. But if we go back in history, historically that has not happened. We've been through this before. In the 1980s, Ronald Reagan came in and had kind of the same agenda where he wanted to shrink government. And a lot of people thought that as a result of shrinking government, that the charitable sector would have more opportunities and have access to more money to be able to carry out those services. Well, that didn't happen. And what happened was nonprofits ended up needing to do more work, but along with workforce cuts, there was also cuts in budgets. And so the money didn't follow. So there was more demand for services and more need, but there wasn't more money. And unfortunately, that's a trend that happens within social services. There's always more need. People who need help, who need social services, always are the hardest hit. And so the people who serve them, typically nonprofits, the need goes up, the demand goes up, but money never follows. So I would pay attention to that, especially if you're in fields where you believe that the federal government workforce shrinking will impact the work that you do. And if budget cuts come and social services are cut, then it may impact the work you do at a local level or local government funding that's available. So it's really hard to say because every agency in the federal government is different. How they administer money, how that money trickles down, what format the money comes in, it's all different for different agencies. So it's really difficult for me to say right now what's going to happen. This department is going to cut it this way and this is going to happen this way. There's no way for me to be able to tell and guess what's going to happen. I can only again give you history and say that if there are a lot of cuts, and typically it's to like human services and social services, healthcare, education, somebody has to pick up the slack, and it's usually nonprofits, and the money doesn't usually follow. So what does that mean for you? How do you need to adjust? How do you fundraise differently? Or how do you advocate to get more money or to demand that the government take care of its citizens? If it's anything like the previous administration, they propose cuts to food stamps, they propose cuts to Medicaid and to housing assistance. And I know that many areas of this country are dealing with homelessness and trying to figure out how to combat homelessness so that people aren't living on the streets. So if we see cuts to things like housing vouchers or supportive housing programs, then that absolutely will have an impact on nonprofits, because government funding does make up a lot of money that nonprofits get. And if nonprofits who have access to that funding, especially that more stable funding, where their budgets really depend on that money, they will be severely impacted. There will be layoffs, and it will impact the local economy in ways that you just don't realize. Everything has a trickle-down effect. It just depends on what happens and how that trickle goes. So I will be paying attention to what's being proposed and what's being cut. And as a start, I would advocate at the state level for the state to kind of help pick up that slack, or the local government to help pick up that slack, but also advocate with your congressman to push to make sure that the services that you believe are needed and vital for your clients stay in place. So the fourth thing that I would be paying attention to is how foundations respond. What do they do in reaction to whatever changes that may come? So in the first Trump administration, if you remember, there were some pretty dramatic policy changes, pretty dramatic proposals put out there, and there was a pretty dramatic response to that. One of the more famous ones is the Muslim ban, where there was a ban on people who were coming from Muslim countries, and that was a pretty sharp response to that. Some foundations started giving out grants to help nonprofits at the local level respond to that, right? So a lot of times you'll see, especially with progressive foundations or foundations that don't agree with the values of the administration, in response to that, their money or their giving priorities will shift to help nonprofits deal with the aftermath of those policy changes. So what I saw in the first administration, which was very interesting, is that there was a lot more funding for advocacy. So instead of funding just for direct programs and giving services directly to clients, there was money flowing to equip people to fight policy changes at their local level or at the national level, which was different and something I hadn't seen at such a level that it was during the first administration. I may be wrong and I'm not that old, but I just hadn't seen it trend in that way. So there was a lot of money flowing around advocacy, especially around the topics that the administration was attacking, right? So I said before, human rights, immigrant rights, climate change, things like that. So you saw a spike in that. And so that changed and shifted how foundations gave out money and what they gave their money to. Not all of them, but very prominent ones like the Ford Foundation, the Open Society Foundation. The other thing is this. Remember the COVID-19 pandemic? Well, there was a response to that as well. So foundations relaxed their typical requirements. A lot of them did this, and they made it easier to access money. They broke down a lot of the barriers that nonprofits had in terms of reporting to access money. They gave more flexible money instead of more strict program grants. It was great. Money was flowing. It was easy. It was what people wanted and had been asking for. And then at some point, it just went back. At some point, the foundations went back to business as normal. Another key area where that shifted was all the talk about racial equity and DEI, which people feel like is just such a scary word. All of the funding that was promoting those initiatives have quietly gone away, and people have been raising alarms about that, about, well, what happened to the response in 2020 with the pandemic and George Floyd and all of that? What are we doing now? We just walking all that back. So I would pay attention to philanthropy and what they do in this moment, because a lot of times they react and they respond. And in some ways they respond with how they give. And finally, tariffs. So I'm going to first say I'm not an economics person. I'm a social worker. But we can get through this conversation. We can understand it. Let's talk about it. So in simplest terms, a tariff is a tax on a good or a product that's coming into the United States. And so there have been a lot of talk about items imported from China where Trump is going to put a tariff on those items. Well, the interesting thing that a lot of people probably don't understand is that the businesses that are bringing those items in or importing those items have to pay the tariff. So if a tariff is in place, they have to pay more to bring those items into the country. And on one hand, I get where people are coming from, where they agree with that, because it's like, well, we want to incentivize stuff being made in America, right? But on another hand, there are some things that practically are not made in America, that are very, very expensive to be made in America. And when there's not enough choice of the price of products, then businesses are forced to up their prices. And guess who they're going to pass along the cost of those tariffs to? To the consumer. So the cost of products, the cost of food is going to go up because a lot of our food and produce does not come from this country. So it's going to impact the price of goods and products even more than what we're dealing with right now. And historically, people with lower incomes are the hardest hit by tariffs. So how does this impact nonprofits? There's a lot of talk about building materials, especially aluminum. So if your nonprofit deals with recovery efforts, let's talk about hurricane recovery efforts and helping people rebuild like in North Carolina. Well, if the cost of building materials go up, then it's going to be really hard to rebuild, especially with nonprofits who are sourcing that material and trying to help people rebuild. It's going to be incredibly expensive to do that work. If people have to pay more for food, then they're going to feel the crunch and going to need to use services more. They're going to need to use their food banks more, which is going to increase the demand on nonprofit organizations and community organizations. And they're going to see more people need their services, but that may not come with more money to pay for that. And one thing I don't think people get is that nonprofits don't operate for free. They do not operate on air. They need money to operate. They have to make money in order to continue to do good work. And if demand goes up, but the availability of money or donations or grants doesn't go up with that, it really creates a hard situation for nonprofits. And a lot of people don't get that. They don't understand that because they think nonprofits are charities and they just somehow magically print money. Even organizations that do work internationally, there may be more trade restrictions and maybe retaliation on the United States. So if you are a United States organization that's doing work in another country, you have to buy things in another country, there may be taxes imposed on you as retaliation for our tariffs. So when there's conflict like that, especially internationally, and it's an economic impact, then it absolutely will impact nonprofits here in the country. And a lot of that, we're at the whim of the government. Whatever they decide, however they want to approach it, we have to feel the impact as citizens, and nonprofits have to feel that impact because nonprofits often absorb and have to deal with the impact on citizens, especially lower income citizens. So again, I would just watch and see the impact on that and think about in your planning, your strategic planning and your fundraising planning, how can you accommodate and adjust for increased need in your community, and how can you communicate that to your donors and to your funders about the increased need, because that may absolutely be a reality. I'll also say that every nonprofit is different. So I'm a social worker, so I tend to talk a lot about social service nonprofits. That's my history. That's what I've worked in. But there are all kinds of nonprofits. There are hospitals, there are research nonprofits, there are policy nonprofits. And some of these nonprofits don't necessarily engage directly with the public. They don't provide direct services. So everybody is different. So take what I'm saying with a grain of salt and make sure you apply it to your situation. But absolutely know all the citizens of the United States will be impacted by this in one way or the other. And we just need to know and be informed to be prepared. The last thing I want to say, a little bonus thing, is around foundations. So the incoming vice president doesn't particularly like foundations because he has stated before that he believes that they're being used as a vehicle for progressives to push their agenda. So foundations are nonprofits. They're just a different type of nonprofit, and they do have to pay tax on income that they make from their investments, but he wants to increase the tax that they have to pay because he believes that they shouldn't have a privilege of being able to push an agenda through their money and not be taxed for it. So that's just something to watch. I haven't seen that he said anything recently about this. He said this in past years. So this absolutely may be an initiative for him or an agenda for him, and that may impact how foundations give. If they have to pay more taxes on their investment income, I know that they're going to give less. It's almost a given that they're going to give less if they have to pay more in taxes, because historically foundations are very conservative about how they give out their money. Even though they may have millions or billions in their endowments and have access to that, they don't give out nearly as much, and they're only required to give 5%. So if they're pushed more to pay more taxes, then they're not going to give more. So pay attention to that as well, because that may impact grants that are made available for nonprofits. So what else should we be mindful of as nonprofits for the incoming administration? I tried to focus on policy changes. Obviously, the values and the priorities of the administration are different, and a lot of people don't agree with particularly the personal stance of the president and his personal remarks, his racist remarks, things like that. And so that I didn't cover because I wanted to really focus more on policy so people can plan well. But let me know your thoughts in the comments and what other things that nonprofits need to be mindful of. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.